What's up, guys? This is Jan for Chess24. We are gonna look at one of the evergreen matchups of today's chess. The world champion Magnus Carlsen against Anish Giri, whom he has famously never defeated in a tournament game. They are facing each other in the penultimate round of the Bilbao Masters round number 9. Magnus Carlsen's been doing well, is leading the field 3 points with their soccer scoring system ahead of Hikaru Nakamura, while Anish Giri has been in trouble. -2 if my count is correct. He's at the bottom of the table. However, he always gets up for a game against Magnus Carlsen, and of course the big question is, can Magnus Carlsen finally win his first classical game of chess against Anish Giri? The world champion starts with a move 1 d4, Giri goes d5, and we see a move that has been becoming popular recently by Magnus Carlsen, the move 2 bishop f4, so-called London system, or the correct bishop opening, as I believe Grecian christened it. Bishop f4 started off as a way to avoid theory, but since it's become more popular, it has its own body of theory by now. Giri does not go for one of the quote-unquote main lines like c5 or knight f6, but plays a very natural move, the move 2 bishop f5, maintaining the symmetry, putting his bishop out of his own future pawn chain, just preparing e6, bishop d6. Very solid move by Anish Giri. Carlsen goes e3, Giri goes e6, and Carlsen plays a move that has rarely been played at the top level, the move bishop d3, offering the exchange of these bishops immediately. Normally, when this position has been reached, white has tried something like knight f3, knight f6, sometimes c4 here. But after knight f3, for example bishop d6, it looks to me like the position is quite balanced already as well. So bishop d3 takes, queen takes, threatening the sneaky queen b5 check, but you're not gonna catch a world-class grandmaster with that. Anish Giri goes c6, puts his pawns on light squares, and Carlsen follows up with knight d2. I'm not sure why he commits the knight to d2 so early and why he doesn't start with knight f3, but it shouldn't matter that much in the grand scheme of things. Maybe he didn't want to allow queen b6 targeting b2, which can sometimes be a little awkward. Knight d2, knight to f6, knight to f3, and Giri curiously decides to play bishop e7, not bishop d6. Both of these moves perfectly fine, but bishop d6 seemed even easier to me, allowing or offering the exchange of bishops, which should lead to equality. I'll be able to speak English in a minute, but for now we're gonna live with the road bumps. Knight f3, bishop e7 on the board, castles. Carlsen plays another useful move for these structures, a move h3, mainly directed against knight h5, trapping this bishop on f4. You don't want to have to worry about that constantly, and h3 makes a nice little retreat square on h2 for that bishop. h3, knight bd7. Now both sides have more or less finished their development, and Carlsen has to decide which plan he wants to pursue. Most natural, to my eyes, was the move c4, hoping to maybe gain some space on the queen side with c5 and b4, getting a little edge there. But probably Carlsen was worried that after c4 black can play c5, and with this tension in the center, it's very likely all these pawns are gonna get exchanged and the game is gonna become dully equal. The world champion, of course, eager to score a victory, doesn't want to allow that. Another possibility is to play e4, but first of all, black does not have to take here. Even here, c5 makes perfect sense, with a complicated position where black should be fine. But even d4, knight e4, knight e4, queen e4, let's say queen b6, is quite a typical structure for openings like the Caro-Kann, where black should not be in any trouble either. Therefore, Carlsen plays a third move that is very non-standard and quite ambitious. He goes a4, trying to grab some more space on the queen side with a5, and trying to provoke black to go a5. Nothing wrong with this, but if you go a5, it's going to be much harder to play c5 in the future, because you've really weakened this b5 square. So no big surprise that Giri does not copy his opponent's move, and instead goes c5, grabbing a bit of space on the queen side himself, and maybe planning to follow up with c4, grabbing even more of that space. Carlsen does not mind, and he continues with a5. That was part of the plan of a4, to restrict the black queen. Now it can't go here, keeping the b6 square under control, but he allows the c4 move, which I believe means that Giri is doing fine out of the opening. So if a5, to my mind, c3 was more prudent. Then if c4, you can go queen c2 and quickly undermine this construction with b3. Well, if black doesn't go c4, He should be alright, but this knight is slightly misplaced for the structure on d7. Would much rather be on c6. Still, after, let's say, queen b6, the position is roughly equal. Anyway, a5 was played, c4, queen e2, and b5. Logical move, grabbing more space on the queen side. White has nothing better, really, than to exchange this pawn. A takes b, a takes b. But here, black has solved all his problems too. This pawn can go to b5. The tension on the a file doesn't really favor white, and there is nothing obvious for white to do. If he tries to play e4, black could just ignore it, play b5, or he could capture on e4, in both cases with a fine position. Therefore, the world champion, in his efforts to complicate the game, goes for knight e5. First sight, not a way to complicate things, because after knight takes e5, which was played, it looks like the most natural move is bishop takes e5, when black's play is kind of simple. You go queen d7, you go b5, e4, b5. There's nothing really to be gained from the central tension, and black is perfectly fine. In fact, I'd slightly prefer black's position here. This wasn't Carlsen's idea. Carlsen's idea was to spice the game up by going d takes e5. That's a very committal move. The good news is this knight is forced away from the center and white gains some space. The bad news is this bishop is really restricted by his own pawns. Therefore, should there ever be action on the queen side, this bishop might not be able to enter it. Therefore, white has to use this bishop in an attack on the king side after committing to d takes e5. Now the plus of d5 is this knight now gains access to the d4 square. But objectively, it's quite risky what Carlsen is doing. I'm not sure if he's worse, but black should be doing more than fine here. Carlsen goes for the most natural move, to my eyes, the move queen g4, threatening bishop h6, and trying to make something happen on the king side. Knight f3, knight d4 also still possible. The computers prefer e4, but after e4, knight c5, ed, ed. The black knight has a fine square on e6, and I believe black is doing absolutely fine here. Therefore, not surprised, Carlsen avoids it. He goes queen g4, threatening bishop h6. Giri parries it with rook e8. Queen c7 was also possible, intending bishop h6, queen takes e5. But after knight f3, I don't think it makes a big difference. The black rook still has to move somewhere. Instead, rook e8 directly has been played, also intending in many lines to play f5, ef6, bishop f6, now that the e6 pawn is covered by the rook. And here Carlsen shows why he is the best in the world. He finds a way to create complications pretty much out of nothing in this position that is not very good for him. Like the natural move would be something like knight f3, but here after knight c5, knight d4, queen d7, black has absolutely everything under control. Can follow up with b5. There's no obvious initiative for white on the king side. Bishop h6 is always well met by bishop h8. So not that interesting for Carlsen. Instead he plays a move h3, h4, which I'm sure not many people would have come up with. This is a pawn sacrifice. You can't take immediately because then you drop the bishop, but you could take after rook takes a1, and now bishop takes h4. However, black had to pay a price, giving up the a-file, and it turns out that white is pretty decent compensation for his pawn here. Bishop h6, threatening checkmate. Another plus, now there's no bishop f8, so you have to go g6, knight f3, bishop e7, and rook a7. White has very fair play for his pawn. Queen f4, intending knight g5 or bishop g5 is on the agenda. This knight can jump into d4. Not a fun position to defend, so I'm not surprised that Anish Giri decides to not take this Greek gift. Instead, Giri decides on the quite extreme looking but quite natural f5. It was possible to just do nothing. The comps once again prefer knight c5, intending to just go queen d7. And it's not clear how black wants to develop how white wants to develop. Really struggling speaking today. How white wants to develop his initiative. Bishop h6 is always well met with bishop f8. But it's a little unpleasant practically to just sit and quote-unquote do nothing, allowing white to build up on the king side. Therefore f5, very natural reaction. And I'm sure Giri expected e takes f6 here, bishop takes f6. When his bishop gets activated on this diagonal, one point of h4, one plus, would be that white can go bishop g5 here, neutralizing this bishop with a roughly equal position. But once again, that was not Carlsen's intention. Instead, he plays the very surprising move queen to h3, which looks passive, but the idea is nothing but passive, but aggression. He wants to follow up with g4 and blow the king side open. This move took Giri by surprise, and once again he decided not to take this pawn. And once again, I believe that's a good decision, because in this position, even though the computer proves it looks like white has a lot of play after g4, let's say f takes g, queen takes g4, knight c5, rook to a7, and the black defense is not easy. This knight can jump around, e6 can be targeted, bishop h6 is still looming. Not a fun position to play. So not surprised that Giri once again avoids this greedy option, and instead he decides to complicate the position by playing c3. It was still possible to play a normal move like knight c5, g4, takes and queen d7 with rough equality, but once again it looks like it's easier to play for white. King h2, rook g1, knight comes over. Very interesting stuff by Magnus Carlsen is h4, queen h3. Giri is looking for counterplay, and to pursue that he goes c3. Pawn sacrifice, his pawn is after b takes c, queen c7. He's targeting c3 and e5. And he wants to distract the white pieces from building up on the king side. Carlsen, of course, is ready for the challenge. He goes c4, doesn't want to tolerate a black queen entering the c3 square, understandably. And here Giri should just have taken on c4. The position remains roughly equal. White does have interesting options like g4 once again, trying to open the position with a bit of a mess, but black can defend here after knight takes e5, takes, whatever. Queen f5, bishop f6. Fire on board, but black should be alright. Instead, Giri commits a serious mistake here after c4. He goes knight takes e5, grabs this pawn, but enters a potentially lethal pin. And that pin is pronounced by Carlsen's next move, queen g3. Black has to go bishop d6. If he played bishop f6 to defend this knight, white is a cute way to win the game immediately. He would like to go knight f3, but after knight f3 this is a check, so this doesn't work yet. Therefore you can prepare it with the devious sidestep king h1, and after let's say dc4, knight f3 picks up a whole piece. White is winning. So you can't do that. You can go bishop d6, but even bishop d6 does have a tactical drawback, which was missed by both players. White had a very nice geometrical motive here. Move c5. B takes c5 is forced because if any other piece captures on c5, e5 is falling. So b takes c5, and now rook to a6, overloading the black defenses. Turns out you can't do anything about rook takes d6 followed by bishop takes e5, when white would not only gain 2 pieces for the rook, but also significant positional advantage. Let's say c4, rook d6, queen d6, bishop e5, queen e7. The material balance isn't that bad for black, but this bishop is so strong that after knight f3, this knight jumps to d4, h5 is coming. It's very likely that the black defenses would collapse here sooner or later. However, both sides missed that opportunity, and instead of c5, Carlsen played the move c takes d5. Naturally enough move, but of course not as strong as this little trick. C takes d, e takes d, and here, once again, a strong practical decision, in my opinion, by the world champion. The move the computers want to see is the move knight f3, which probably wins a pawn, actually. The computer lines takes, bishop takes f4, queen takes d5, check, queen f7, takes, e takes f4. All of a sudden, white has an extra pawn in the rook endgame. However, this rook endgame should be a relatively easy draw for a player of Giri's caliber. Rook c8, targeting a2, targeting c2. And it's very likely that we're going to reach a drawn 4 versus 3 rook endgame. That's not Carlsen's intention. Instead of winning a pawn, he decides to sacrifice a pawn. Go knight b3 to bring his knight to the best square on the board on d4. And he's correctly judged that he does have enough long-term compensation for this pawn, which Giri correctly takes. Queen c2, knight d4, queen back to c8, covering f5. More active move, queen d3 was also possible, because this rook can't enter the action yet. Let's say here, check. King h3, queen h1, and black is first. Like queen c8 is more natural, going for the d7 square, using the same tactic. Speak slowly, Jan. After rook a7, there's queen c1 check and knight to g4. Therefore, Carlsen doesn't have a way to break through immediately, and of course he's anticipated that, just quietly reinforces his position by going h5, taking the g6 square away from the knight should he ever need it. Sometimes h6 is going to be an idea. Just putting the ball back in black's court. Queen d7, logical move covering a7. Rook to b1. If this rook can't go to a7, at least it should find some work targeting the b6 pawn. Bishop c7 covers it. And another strong, slowish move by Magnus Carlsen. Move f2, f3. Take some squares for the knight, from the knight, so this king can now go to h2 or f2 more safely without being harassed by knight g4 check. And once again, asking Giri to make a move. Queen f7 played by Giri. This is a very natural move, targeting the h5 pawn and still keeping sight of h5, of f5 and d5. And Carlsen once again shows good sense of the position. Goes rook a1 now, threatening to put his rook back to a7. You can't allow that. Queen takes h5, for example, rook a7, rook e7, knight b5. And once again, this construction on this diagonal collapses, white wins a piece. Not gonna be able to do it. Therefore, the bishop has to go back to d6, keeping sight of the a7 square. Rook a6, if you can't go to a7, at least to a6. And this is where Giri decides to force the issue. In a bit of time trouble, move 30 here and capture the pawn on h5. There were alternatives. The most computer-esque was the move queen b7, but in order to play that you had to calculate some very sick complications, starting with knight takes f5, keeping an eye on the g7 square. And here the computer spits out stuff like takes, ef, rook to f8, and apparently black is alright because white can't keep everything covered. But good luck calculating that with limited amount of time on the clock. Another way to play was queen d7, allowing rook takes b6 because now black gains counterplay with bishop c5. But none of this is easy, and it shows that Giri's position was quite difficult to defend in practice. Queen takes h5 is entering a forced line where black loses material, but he frees his position. Rook takes b6, knight to c4, giving up two pieces for a rook, but at least the rook can capture on e3. And the material balance is not all that bad for black. He does have a rook and two pawns versus two minor pieces. That's rough material equality. The problem is his king is quite weak on g8 because of this earlier f5 move. Carlsen plays the most logical move, the move bishop e5, threatening checkmate. The comps prefer to immediately go queen f4. We're going to see that a move later in the game, without having lured the black queen to g6, where it slightly better plays on an h5. And here, white is better, but the game continues after check and rook b1. Once again looking for counterplay with rook b2. Instead, bishop e5 was played, queen g6 is forced. White doesn't want to enter an endgame here under any circumstances. Let's say knight takes f5, works tactically. But after queen g3, bishop g3, this position is most likely a draw. Very hard to win with just these two pawns in an endgame. That's not Carlsen's idea. He wants to go queen f4. And he thought from a distance that this position was almost winning for him because knight takes f5 can't be stopped. But Giri finds another nice resource, showing some of his tenacity as a defender here. Goes rook e1 check, king f2 and rook a1. His point being that after knight takes f5, he can activate his rook with rook a2 check, and the position remains very complex. This didn't happen in the game, just showing you the line. For example, king e1, only good square for the king, queen g2, knight e7 is checkmate. But black can go queen e6, pinning this bishop, and the game continues very much. Knight g7 is a mistake because of queen b6, threatening all kinds of unpleasantness, and white doesn't have a check, so you can't do that. And if you, let's say, unpin instead of knight g7, go king f1, then black goes h6, creating a square for his king in case you need it. Once again, knight g7 loses, this time to queen g6. So things wouldn't have been clear at all, and white still has work to do. But Carlsen finds a move I'm a big fan of, at least practically. I believe this move is incredibly strong. Instead of going knight f5, rook a2, which clearly Giri has been calculating in time trouble, he plays the very humble move queen d2. Just covering the a2 square, but also showing some aggressive ideas, like knight takes f5, followed by queen takes d5 check. And here, in order to stay in the game, Giri had to readjust to the new situation. You don't calculate a move like queen d2 in time trouble, and find something like queen a6, intending rook a2 or queen f1, when white is not in time to go knight takes f5 because of rook a2, bishop b2, queen b7, picking up this bishop. Therefore, after queen a6, white has to be more humble, go knight e2, and after, let's say, queen b6 check, the fight continues. Bishop d4, queen a5, nice little trick, now that d5 is no longer hanging. Complicated position, looks like a computer would defend this for black at the very least. Instead, Giri crumbles here, plays the move rook a8, and that is very unfortunate square for the rook, because the rook will be attacked after queen takes d5. If you're going to move the rook, you should have put it on a7, covering the 7th rank and not entering this diagonal, when white still has to find a way to break through. Queen c2 favors white, but the game continues. Rook a8 played, and that allows Carlsen this pretty obvious tactical blow. Knight takes f5, which more or less ends the game. Queen f5 doesn't work because of queen d5, followed by queen a8. Knight e7 is a threat, so you don't really have time to cover the d-pawn. The g7 pawn is on priest, and the white king is quite safe here. So nothing really works for black. Giri plays the move queen e6, the best chance, hoping for something like this, which would be a grave, grave mistake. Not only is his endgame tough to win, after rook a5 he even loses material along the 5th rank. So clearly not what white should be doing. Instead, Carlsen continues to focus on the initiative, finds a nice move, queen g5, which more or less wraps it up. Because there's a tactical trick, queen takes e5, knight h6, picks up the queen, game over. And g7 is under attack. Only move therefore, g6, knight h6 check, king f8, knight g4. Now the player's made it to the time control, and black's position is hopeless. Not so much because of the material, but because of the difference in piece activity. White will just invade along the dark squares. One big difference is that his king is always completely safe. After rook a2, the king just goes to g3, and on this diagonal nothing bad can ever happen to him. Well, now it would be white's turn to do something active. Instead, Giri tried king e8, tried to run away from the danger zone with his king. Carlsen chose knight f6 check, not the only good move, but good enough, picking up the h7 pawn without giving up on the idea of checkmating the black king. Queen f4 check, followed by knight g5 check, pretty much on the agenda, so black's task is kind of hopeless. Giri tries rook a4 to stop queen f4 check, but that allows a nice combination, which the world champion spots after some thought. The move queen to d8, sacrificing his bishop. And the point is, either immediately or after rook a2, king g1 check, if this bishop is captured, white is a series of checks that win the black queen. Queen f8, king e6, queen e8, king d6, queen b8, king e6, all forced, because you have to keep covering the queen. Knight f8 check. And we see this king doesn't have a lot of squares. King f6, knight d7 check, picks up the queen. King f5, g4 check, still king f6, knight d7, or king f4, knight takes g6, once again, picking up the queen and ending the game. Because of that, Giri does resign after, when did he resign? After rook a2 check, king g1. There's just nothing to do. You don't even have a useful spy check. All the squares are covered. So, Magnus Carlsen defeats Anish Giri for the first time ever in a tournament game. We're gonna have to add a little 1 here in a nice effort in very world champion-esque style. He didn't get anything out of the opening, but he managed to come up with fresh ideas in this not very promising position, h4 and queen h3, in my opinion, the star moves of this early phase. Then he missed a nice combination with c5 instead of c takes d5. But he kept the initiative after cd, ed, knight b3, kept posing problems. The next star move of the game, to my mind, the move queen to d2. Very, very unpleasant move to face in time trouble. And Giri did collapse, which also underlines Giri's bad form throughout this tournament, which has led to a lot of happiness apparently by Giri haters online in the social media world. I don't really understand why it gives them pleasure to see a talented super grandmaster struggle in a tournament, but whatever makes people happy, I guess. Magnus Carlsen's fans have every reason to be happy because he's won the Bilbao Masters with 1 round to spare. Let's look at the standings after 9 of 10 rounds. They use this 3-point system with 3 points for win, so it's a little confusing, but we can see Magnus Carlsen is 5 points ahead of Hikaru Nakamura. You can only score 3 for win, so he's won with 1 round to go. Congratulations to the world champion for his, I don't even know, 28th Super Tournament victory. Some obscene number, showing by far the best play and the most enterprising play in this Bilbao Masters, where every day he's been responsible of providing the entertainment. He's certainly come through. Congratulations to him, and I hope I'll see you guys, I don't know, maybe for the last round video, maybe some other time. Thanks for watching. Go premium on chess24.com if you haven't already. See you soon.